welcome to Presents. I'm your host, Skye Mcgehee. We are joined this week by Dr. Kelly Rossetto, an associate professor here at Boise State. Her research revolves around interpersonal and family communication, as well as stress and coping in relationships. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rossetto. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here.
So I know that you're a professor, but what exactly does your job here at Boise State entail?
That's a really good question. Most people see us in the classroom, and so they think that that's what our job is all about. And so often when we're doing our work, people don't quite understand what we are doing. We can't be grading all the time, right?
Right.
So we do kind of think about our jobs in terms of three areas. So we have the teaching, of course, which is where most of the students see us, and then we have our research, and then we have service. So things that we do around the university that get us involved in the community, that help make it function in our department. So that's the service with our research. Everybody's is so vast. So in the Department of Communication and Media, we've got people studying all sorts of things surrounding media, of course, and then in the communication side of the department, we've got people who are studying organizational communication, family communication, cultural communication, rhetoric, and so it's very varied. And so that's where we can kind of go and do our own things and really dive into what interests us. So that's exciting. And then hopefully that also then translates into some of the classes that we get to teach.
Right. So what approach do you take when teaching your research to your students?
Well, you know, sometimes you're teaching courses where the specifics of what you research aren't necessarily in the class, but I've been fortunate enough to be able to bring my resilience research really into the classroom. So I designed a senior seminar course that the content is surrounding resilience, and so throughout the course we do activities and we do workshopping that helps actually build resilience, while also I'm teaching them the different levels of resilience, so individual resilience, relational resilience, community resilience, organizational resilience. And so they're learning the content of what I'm researching, but also then doing activities that help build their own resilience, and hopefully in that way creating more resilient students to go out into the workforce.
Right. So speaking of resilience, what barriers did you face on your own path, and what does that say about your own personal resilience?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think everyone experiences barriers. Everybody experiences failures, roadblocks, and I think that going through college, I wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do. I think sometimes students have the idea that the minute we step into college, we need to know if we want to be a professor or a doctor or whatever it is. And I certainly wasn't one of those students. And so I think for a long time I just tested the waters and tried to figure out my path. And I was a psychology major as well as a communication major. And I started in psychology, but then I took some communication classes, and so I kind of took that path. And so I just kind of kept coming back to communication. And I think I don't want to think about that as a barrier necessarily, but it took me a little while to kind of figure out what exactly I wanted to do. And so it wasn't like I jumped right in after college. I went and I did other things, and then I went back to school. And then graduate school can be a barrier. It's tough. I think it takes a lot of perseverance, and you really have to know that it's what you want. And so that was a real challenge. And then just kind of moving forward, you have life events that get in the way of work and that make you lose focus. And so, of course, I've experienced those as well. But, a lot of times I feel like my colleagues in graduate school or my coworkers at the universities that I've taught with and then my students really kind of help pull me through when the tough things happen on the sidelines.
Right.
And so really engaging that support. And it helps that I study supportive communication and I study resilience and coping to think about, okay, I know that I'm having this grief experience, or I know that I'm having this stressful job experience, or whatever it is.
Right.
And I know that I have these tools. And if I can teach these tools, that means I can do these things too. And so I really try to pull from that.
Okay. Can you expand a little bit more on what your research entails?
Sure. So over time, do you want me to kind of start at the beginning? Or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So when I was actually a master's student, so a very long time ago, my research started with grief and supportive communication in families. And moving forward, I knew that I wanted to continue to study supportive communication and coping, but I wasn't sure that I always wanted to be in the context of death. And so I moved onto my PhD program where I started studying military families. And so I was looking at how military partners and their families cope with deployment. And so looking at, and then that has evolved to think about how does social media play a part in that? How does technology help enable coping? And so I really kind of absorbed myself in the military research and have really enjoyed that. I've continued to collect data with military families and have continued to do that work with people, trying to understand the ways in which they get through these challenging events that occur during deployment and just as being a part of military life. And now, most recently, my research has kind of evolved a little bit differently, where understanding the student experience has become really important to me. I've been now teaching at the college level for over a decade, and really seeing the communication surrounding the stress that college students are facing. And so if I'm studying stress and resilience and I'm working with college students every day, it felt really necessary for me to combine those two things and to start understanding college students a little bit better. And so my most recent research is with a colleague here on campus, Dr. Eric Martin, in kinesiology, and we're working on two separate projects. One is looking at the stress and resilience of Boise State students, and also the ways in which different campus leaders across the university are impacting student resilience. And so we've talked with people from Gender Equity Center or from Multicultural Student Services or from Student Affairs, the Dean of Students, Honors College, all of student housing, kind of everywhere, to really get a feel for, okay, what are the things that your programs are doing that are maybe touch points for student resilience? And then the second project that we're working on is with the NCAA, and we're looking at the transition from high school to college for student athletes. And we've developed workshopping for first-year student athletes to help them kind of think about becoming more balanced in their identity, coping strategies, supportive resources, and leadership, all of which tie to resilience.
Right, being known more than just an athlete. Mm-hmm. So what qualitative methods have you used to explore those?
Well, like you're doing right now. I do a lot of interviewing. Mm-hmm. Because of the types of questions that I ask often revolve around in-depth experiences. Right. And so when I'm trying to understand deployment experiences and challenges and the ways that people are coping and supporting within their families, I want to know their lived experience. Right. I want to really dive deep. And so interviews are the right way to do that. As I mentioned, I also have been doing the interviews across campus. But I do also use survey methods. So we're using surveys to understand student stress, anxiety, support, perfectionism, self-esteem, all sorts of things through a big, giant survey that we thank our students for taking part in. But majority of my research has been with interviews.
Okay. How do you define supportive communication?
I think about supportive communication as any type of communication that's really intended to help somebody who's in need. Right. And so that can happen in a variety of forms. And sometimes it's more through our messaging, sometimes it's nonverbal, sometimes it's through the acts that we do. And so some people kind of say, well, do you study psychology? Do you study communication? Like some of it's behavioral, some of it's communicative. And I say yes, all of the above. But I think about different types of support. So, we have our emotional support where if I need a shoulder to cry on, or I really just want somebody to listen to me, to understand my emotions, and to get me through a hard time. We have more tangible or instrumental support, which is help me do something. Right. Like, will you help me study for the test? Or will you loan me your truck so I can move, right? So that's more instrumental. Then we've got esteem support, which is when I just need to feel validated. I need you to kind of boost my self-esteem, my sense of worth. And then we've got informational support, which is more advice and information. And so it's really about gauging kind of the need of the person. Like, what do they want from me? What is their situation? How can I help them through it? And so if the goal is to help somebody through something, then we really kind of have to tailor our behavior or our message to it. And so it can involve one of those types of support. And of course there are others. And I'm really interested in peer support, so how that happens between two people that really understand each other's experience, whether that's with an illness or deployment.
Right. So what are some signs, or how do you identify someone who has a strong support system?
Well, I think that I'm not sure so much that I would know how to identify if they do. I think we could identify if they don't, because they wouldn't have people to talk to, right? I mean, we see it if we see belonging and we see people who are together, but I don't want to assume that just because somebody is in the presence of other people that they're necessarily supportive. Right. I could have a family relationship, a friendship, and it doesn't mean that that person is necessarily supportive of me, right, or offering me support when I need it, or even getting at more complexity, offering the kind of support that I need. Right. So one of the things that we're measuring with students is what is the type of support that they desire or that they need, and then what's the kind of support that they're actually receiving, and do those match up, right? Because if we're getting all sorts of information, but we're not getting emotional support, and we really want emotional support, like, we need to sort of, limit that gap a little bit. And so in terms of understanding if somebody has enough support, I think often we need to ask, right? We need to, as professors, as friends, as peers in the classroom, like, do you have somebody to study with? Right. Do you have somebody that you can talk to about that if a problem arises? I'm not a counselor, so but I can point them in the right directions, or I can get students involved together so that they can start to feel that sense of belonging, that sense of support that is imperative for resilience, and also for retention and staying here on campus.
Yeah. Give them the resources they need.
Yeah.
To what extent are coping mechanisms situational versus based on their personality?
Whenever I teach coping, I get a lot of, but it depends. Like, how would you cope with X situation? Well, it depends. And I think that's very true. And so I think that in terms of personality, and I don't study personality traits specifically, but I think if I think about that more as individual, so what is my preference? I, of course, am going to have some certain types of preferences when it comes to the ways that I attempt to cope. So am I a problem solver? Am I always somebody that's trying to fix the problem? Or do I just want to feel better? Like, go for a run or do some yoga or take a long shower, talk to a friend. And so I think that it's individual in the sense that we tend to kind of find our typical coping strategies. And I try to combat that for myself and when I teach coping and resilience, because what I think we need to do is we need to put all of the types of strategies out on the table so that if I try something and it doesn't work, I'm not at a loss, right? Then what I can do is I can pull from something else. And so the more coping strategies we have in our toolkit, so to speak, the more we have to pull from and the more likely we're going to be successful. And then in terms of situation, the way that we cope mostly, I would say, in many cases is going to depend on if we think that it's something that's in our control or if it's something that's out of our control. If it's something that's in our control, we can work towards solving that problem. But there's many, many things in this life that we don't have control over. And so what can I do? Do I just say I give up, I give in, and not get out of bed in the morning? Well, I certainly hope not, right? And so we have to do things to try to manage our feelings, manage our emotions, rather than try to fix the problem. So with military couples or with grieving families, right? Those are situations that they couldn't fix. They couldn't take it away, can't take away a death as much as we would like to, and they couldn't necessarily bring their spouse back from war. right? But they can do things in the family to keep it running. They can do things to reframe and think more positively. They can talk to friends. They can utilize technology to talk to their partner who's deployed. There's all sorts of things that we can do even if we can't make the stressor go away.
Right. So what kind of things did you teach military families, or would you like to teach military families on how to deal with deployment?
Good question. Well, unfortunately, in terms of, where our research often survives, which is in research journals, which probably from doing research in your classes, I'm hoping that in presenting at conferences and presenting my material in different places that military families have been able to learn from it. There's certain websites that allow us to upload information and those sorts of things. So I do hope that people have learned from it.
Right.
What I would want them to hopefully take away aligns with what I said before, that we can't take the problem away, but there's a whole host of things that we can try and that we can do. Some military partners have children, some don't, right? I think that one of the things that really always struck me from the interviews that I did was this sense of gaining independence, this sense of gaining a sense of control over life, even when they couldn't control the deployment, right? And so if I can just manage what's going on here, if I can set schedules, and if I can know that I'm able to do these things for myself, then things are going to be okay. And number one, I guess I should say, is reach out, get support. Don't think that you have to do it on your own. So yes, independence and knowing that you can do it in the household without your partner there, but reach out to those networks. And that's harder for military partners who aren't living on base or don't have their community of people right around them. And so hopefully learning who they can be around, who they can seek their support from, and really engaging the resources that are available, because they're vast. There's a lot. But with that, also training the general public to understand the challenges of deployed partners or military-affiliated students in the context of a campus, so that we also know how to support them, that they don't only have to rely on peers, they can also rely on their broader community.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's probably a stigma around that and around mental health with veterans, obviously. What initially got you interested in studying the military and just this area of research in general?
I would say that the thing that got me interested in supportive communication was I had an experience in high school. A friend of mine died in a motorcycle accident. And his mom, who is still, all these years later, one of my very close friends, she brought us into her home, and she talked with us for hours and hours and hours. And I don't know if we were helping her more or if she was helping us more.
Right.
At the time, I thought she was helping us more. And when I got, a few years out, I was like, how did she do that? Plus, she had another child, right? And it always just struck me, like, how does a person overcome something that seems unbearable, right, and still be there for all of these kids, right, including her own? And so that really, when I started reading communication work and supportive communication work specifically, she just kept popping into my head. And so I was like, I want to understand, how do parents support their surviving children, and how do they overcome this grief and this loss and move forward in life in such amazing and meaningful ways. And it still is probably the most impactful research that I've done to date. And that was probably one of my first biggest research project. So who would have thought that, like, my first big project, A, I picked a kind of a hard topic, but B, would have continued to be so meaningful all these years later.
So what kind of advice would you give people that are just starting out but are looking to take kind of a similar path as you?
Let yourself follow your path. Mine wasn't from A to B. I explored all sorts of other things in the interim. And so just because you started as a history major, communication major, whatever it is, right, doesn't mean that that's where you have to stay. If I hadn't continued to let communication draw me in, I would not be here. It wasn't my initial major in my undergrad. It wasn't my initial concentration in my master's program either. But in both situations, there was a professor or a class that drew me in and made me realize that that's what I wanted. And so I think just realizing that it's okay to make those changes. It's okay to not know what you want, because eventually it might take a lot of trial and error, but eventually you get there. And I knew, I mean, now when I look back, even as an undergrad, I knew that I thought that I wanted to be some sort of counselor, right? Or I wanted to work with teenagers-ish, and I wanted to help them thrive in a time that is really tumultuous. And now I'm looking at what I'm doing with college students. I'm like, whoa, I'm kind of doing what I thought I wanted to do at 19, even though it was a completely different path to get there. And so for me, it did kind of come full circle, but for others, it doesn't. It's something completely, you wanted to be an engineer and now you're a chef, you know?
Right.
But allow yourself to follow your purpose, and to know what you want, to know what you enjoy, and to know what would be good for others. For you to do as well, because sometimes we can be really good at something but we don't love it. Sometimes we could really love something but people don't really need us to do it. Or we're not very good at it, right? And so kind of finding how those things align and thinking about your own purpose, your own values, your own identity, how those things can align to kind of put you in the right place.
Right. So finally, what made you choose Boise State to teach at and to research at?
Good. A variety of reasons, I guess. I was teaching, I went from the University of Texas where I got my PhD, and my first job was in Boston. And I'm from Montana, and that felt real far away. And I loved living in Boston. I thought it was an amazing city, and I enjoyed working there, but I wasn't finding my fit, my place. And I kind of knew I always wanted to move back west. And Boise State had our communication and media department had a master's program, and I wasn't working with master's students at the time. And so I felt a lot of opportunity for seeing the growth in that master's program, but also seeing Boise State grow into more of a research institution, but that also had a really strong focus on students, which was important to me. I like to have that balance. And it was in the West, and I got to be back in the mountains, and I got to be closer to family. And so it was a host of professional and personal reasons, which I think are both equally important when we make our life choices.
Yeah, definitely probably interesting to start somewhere that's still growing and still changing, so you can kind of be part of that whole process to help it develop and thrive, excuse me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. Thank you again to Dr. Kelly Rossetto for coming on to the show. I'm your host, Skye Mcgehee, and this has been Presents.
Thank you.
I ran out.